Yes.
Okay, perfect. All right. Good afternoon, everybody. You get to see this presentation for the first time. So I am so excited about being here and getting, to having the opportunity to share this information with you. So today we're going to be talking about individuals with disabilities, and that the fact that they have the same rights to have use and enjoyment of their home, the property, and all of the amenities that come with that property. I don't know if you all were in the presentation before, but it was also um, about people with disabilities and talking about animals and reasonable accommodations. That's something that many of the housing providers seem to have an issue with. So my name is Mahalia Dryden Mason. It's a whole lot to remember. So I'd like to be known as Molly. It's very easy. And this is not about me, it's about the information that I'm bringing that I am hoping will help, people with disabilities to know what their rights are and to know what their responsibilities are under the law. So my agency is DPOR, Department of Professional and Occupational Regulation. We lovingly call it DPOR. This is an agency that is involved in a lot. We regulate everything that is not legal, financial, or medical. So your contractors, your lead workers, your asbestos workers, engineers, architects, branch pilots, and we have the real estate industry, which makes our office unique because we are stuck in a regulatory agency versus like an equal rights agency or a human rights agency. Um, we want to welcome each and every one of you because this is an important discussion. This is an important sharing of information. One of the parts of fair housing that I fell in love with was the amount of power it gives people with disabilities in this law. But you would not know that power unless somebody like me with a big mouth bring all this information to you, because it seems to be that they're trying to keep it as the best kept secret in America. So welcome to all of you. Let me introduce you to my alter ego. I call him the messenger to people with disabilities. And you see he has his little emblem on his chest. So he's going to be telling you a lot of stuff today. So our topic, fair housing for individuals with disabilities. So according to the nation, it seems to be one of the most challenging protected classes. And I think it is part of the reason for it is that so many of us think that whatever a person has, they seem to believe it's going to jump off that person and come onto us. We try to shirk away from facing things that could potentially be our future. In fact, the community of people with disabilities remind many of those who are able-bodied that even though they may be able-bodied today, anything can happen. And tomorrow, you could possibly be a person with disabilities. So before I get started, I wanted to kind of open it up and let some folks talk to me about maybe something that they encountered as a person with disability or something that your client encountered as a person with disability before we get into the meat and potatoes of this. So anybody wants to share, please. If Sehar would allow them to talk and let us know a little bit about what you may have been through or what your client may have been through. No shy people, right? We're supposed to have people ready to talk. This is your opportunity to tell us what's going on.
Well, actually, Mally, they can provide some comments on the chat box
Okay.
because they're all muted. Yeah.
Okay. So can you like let me know if you see anything written? Because I can't see it.
Yes. We have something from Ellen, having a care companion animal in their residence.
Uh-huh. So they have a companion animal. They're having issues with that companion animal? Because I was listening to I hosted that assistance, companion, and emotional support class just earlier, and one of the participants kept asking about people and being dishonest about how they are asking for an animal when they really don't need to have that animal. My opinion in that has always been, how can you say that? Because just there's no certain look for a person with a disability. So I, as a person that may look quite normal to somebody, could have a disability. It doesn't mean that I don't have one. It means that I have one. And if I say, hey, I need an animal because this animal is helping me to cope and be able to live here and enjoy my home, then you're supposed to have that animal there. And I think we've always told housing providers, you can't bring your opinions to this job. You can't bring your judgments to this job. You need to look at the facts. And as long as that person brought you a verification that they need an animal, then that's what you need to look at and not try to get into whether they're telling a lie or not, So, anyone else?
No, I don't see any other comments.
Oh my goodness, I thought I would have been getting all kinds of comments today from folks, because I'm sure, sometimes you've been through stuff, and don't be ashamed to talk about it, because someone else may be listening in that have been through the same thing, and they may be hesitating, thinking that, it's not important, or we don't need to talk about it. We do. So one of the things that I'm going to do is give you a quick review of the Fair Housing Act and the Virginia Fair Housing law. So when we look at what is fair housing, that is a question that is asked often. So according to the Fair Housing Act, when you look at fair housing, you're looking at the Fair Housing Act that protects people from discrimination, whether they're buying or they're renting or getting a mortgage or seeking to get some type of assistance for housing, or engaging in any of the other housing related activities. Could be involved in advertising or something of the sort. Then that the law will be applied there. So it doesn't matter that advertising could be about different topics. In this case, when you're advertising based on housing, you have to follow the law. When you're constructing your multifamily communities of 4 units or more, they have to follow the requirements of the law. Same with the Virginia law. It says here, it is the policy of the Commonwealth of Virginia to provide for fair housing throughout the Commonwealth to all its citizens, regardless of any of the protected classes, which now we went from 8 protected classes to 12. So whether, sometimes people look at fair housing and they look at the word fair and housing. So when they will call our office, most times they are saying, hey, Ms. Molly, I need to talk to you about my landlord, and this landlord isn't taking care of the maintenance here. And I would say to them, well, is this landlord treating everyone exactly the same? Like they're not doing any maintenance for anyone, or is it particularly you? And they would say, well, they really don't take care of maintenance for anyone. And I would say to them, well, unfortunately, that is not something that we would help you with, because unless they are treating you differently from the way they treat others, then we would be involved, because that would be discrimination. So we fight discrimination in housing. We don't take care of the maintenance and all that. That should be Residential Landlord Tenant Act. So, come on, thing, move. Okay, so when we look at the laws, we now have the Federal Act, and the Federal Act is now 54 years old, which is a drop in the bucket. The Virginia law is now 50 years old. We started out 4 years after the Federal Fair Housing Act. So the Federal Fair Housing Act has the origin of fair housing, which was 4 protected classes at the time when that was enacted in 1968. It was enacted 7 days after the assassination of Martin Luther King, and that was done on April 4th, 1968. On April 11th, 1968, we received what is now known as the Federal Fair Housing Act, Title VIII of the Civil Rights Act. During that time, there were 4 protected classes, because at that time, the discrimination was based on those 4. So it was race and color, national origin, national origin and religion. Those were the 4 reasons that people were denied housing back then. Then in 1974, upon the determination and the fight that women put up, finally, sex became a protected class, meaning that we should not treat the sexes differently. But, even though laws may change, the thinking of people may take a while. And even today, there is a continuance of discrimination based on sex. Religion, we remind people that religion was a thing that, many of the forefathers did not adhere to. They didn't want to have a specific religion here. They wanted to make sure that people could come here regardless of what religion they had, regardless of what their beliefs were. This was going to be a place of democracy, a place of freedom. Shockingly, 2 of the protected classes that were added in 1988 seem to be so, well, I would say like they forgot about them, even though these are things that have been occurring over and over. People have had to have children. And even to think that in this country, families with children didn't have protection, so they could be kicked out of housing, or they could be denied housing and not even have to worry about it. And also people with disabilities, something that has been happening from day one. Virginia became the first Southern state to have a fair housing law. In fact, there were 11 years prior to the next Southern state, which was North Carolina. And then I think it was like 13 years after North Carolina, South Carolina got their law. Here in Virginia, we went through some amendments. We do have the same 7 protected classes as the federal government has. For this reason, when the federal government enacted fair housing, one of the things they said was, rather than have one law for the 50 states, we allow each state to independently have their own fair housing law. If they independently have it, they can also, in their government fair housing offices act as a what you would call you would be doing the work of HUD for HUD, but on a state level. So we were the first office to actually become a FAP, which is a Fair Housing Assistance Program, because we assist HUD with doing training, investigations, enforcement of the law. So after we adapted the 7 protected classes back in 1983, fair housing in Virginia added 1 more protected class, making it 8. So that protected class was elderliness. In 2020, we received 4 new protected classes. Amongst them were 3 of them that I had been asked about for, I say, 17 years, because people wanted to know, Ms. Molly, are they ever going to make source of funds a protected class so that people can have housing and have choices of housing and raise their children up in better communities? And I said, I don't know, but there are many that are fighting for it. Same with sexual orientation and gender identity. Ms. Molly, do you ever think that they're going to have? With that one, I kind of said, well, you know, it's Virginia, and who knows? Because, hey, it is Virginia. And lo and behold, 2020, July 1st, it went into law. It was signed and ready to go. Source of funds, sexual orientation, gender identity, and veteran status. And then they changed veteran status to military status in 2021. So, quick review of each of the protected classes under the fair housing law. And when I say quick, it's going to be a quick review. So race has been created here in this hemisphere. Race is a social construct designed to place people in social boxes where they can be held down socially and economically, with privilege going to one group above others. But we know this. And I was telling my guru, I get a lot of flack when I talk about race, and I the only thing I can think about is that is because I am a person of color, and people, I guess, are kind of shocked that I am able to talk about race as candidly as I do. But this is the oldest way to discriminate, and it's the number 1 in complaints in Virginia. Is anybody shocked that it's number 1 in complaints in Virginia? I wasn't, because you still have that mentality that still believes that people of color shouldn't have rights. They should be still in the field working and toiling from sun up to sundown, getting whipped, and all the other stuff that used to happen to them. Color, when it comes to color, you're looking at the person's skin pigmentation. And that pigmentation, even though they may not be a person of African descent, even though we all are because of the diaspora, but even though they're not a person directly with the African descent, if their skin is of color, they may be thought of as a person that is of African descent. Homer Plessy rode on the train to Louisiana. He was pulled off the train because he was in first class, where he paid his money to ride. He wanted to show them that that separate but equal did not mean a thing, that it was just a lie. So even though he was 1/8 African American, and 1/8 is very little, that thing about Black blood still exists. Some people still say if you have a drop of Black blood, you're Black. But I'm still looking for the Black blood that they're talking about, because whenever I cut myself, it's nice, bright, and red. It only turns Black if it's sitting out and the air is getting to it. National origin. It refers to someone born outside of the U.S. or is a descendant of such person. Now, when it comes to national origin, one of the groups that they have in under this title is the Native American. But they are the most original people of this country. Why are they considered national origin? Also in this group, you will find that they were protecting the Irish, they were protecting the Africans, the Chinese, and the Mexicans. Because there was one time when the West Coast was part of Mexico, and we seem to forget that land was stolen from Mexico. So they lived there. Religion. As I said before, many of our forefathers were agnostic. They did not want this country to have a particular religion. They opened it up that anyone with religion or without religion should come here and not have to worry. But even the other day, there was that controversy about people being on the plane and playing gospel music. And some were saying it was a chartered flight, but it was not. They were saying all kinds of things about, they stop us from playing our music. But I think they do not realize that this is something that is written into our law, that we should keep law and religion separate. You should not be bringing them together, but we continue to do this with so many having the opinion that we are a Christian country. I believe if they really and truly took the numbers, we would be surprised. Religion also talks about, looking at how you treat some of your clients too. We may have some clients needing shelter. If they go to a shelter and that shelter is saying to them, the only way you can get any kind of service from us is by joining our religion, that is not something that they are supposed to do. So that would be considered a not good action under fair housing law. So you definitely want to remind, even in communities where you have housing and you invite certain groups, yeah, they could come in as a religious group. They want to do lunch or something of the sort. Great idea, but they can't push that religion on anyone. If someone wants to ask about religion, then they can, give them information about it. When it comes to sex, it means that both male and female are to receive the same type of housing services regardless of their gender. Some of the issues that women have dealt with is not being able to rent without having a man around. Some have told me about their experiences with that. Others have experienced sexual harassment. We just had a case up in Harrisonburg, Virginia, where there was a $335,000 settlement because you had a manager who thought that he had the right to exchange sex for housing benefits. He would propose this to the women. Those who did not want to participate with him in his extracurricular activities were oftentimes punished for not giving in to his wants. He was also accused of using racial slurs towards residents and towards their guests. He even tried to prohibit them from having any kind of visitors that were African American. Another part of sex is domestic violence. When you look at domestic violence, 88% of those who are victims and survivors of domestic violence are females. So being it affects them. One of the things that happens in housing is that many times housing providers are saying things like, well, she's the one that he's coming here to find, so she's the reason. And in order to keep our residents safe, we will not renew her lease, or we will just evict her because she's a problem. Well, that's a problem, because then that person is is hurt twice, is victimized twice. Once because they are a victim of the abuse, and the second time because now the housing provider has evicted them from their home, and it is the number one reason for homelessness in America. The ACLU is the organization that takes on these cases. We had the case of Lakeisha Briggs, and Miss Briggs was beaten up by a boyfriend several times. Second to last time she was beaten up, the person used a brick and beat her. The police stood over top of her and told her the next time that they would encourage the landlord to evict them, because there in Norristown, Pennsylvania, there is an ordinance, a nuisance ordinance, that says if you call the police 4 times in 3 months, then the landlord is going to be encouraged to evict you. So here it was. She was beaten that last time, stabbed in her neck with a bottle, running away from the neighbors, trying to not allow them to call the cops. But anyhow, they did. She was medevaced, and upon her release from the hospital after surgery, she was given an eviction notice. They sued the city of Norristown, Pennsylvania, resulting in a $495,000 $495,000 settlement. Banks have been denying women the closing on their homes if they are on maternity leave. Those banks have said things like women don't return to work after they've had a baby. If this is happening to you or anyone around you, then you need to let them know about fair housing. 2 doctors had to sue their banks because their banks actually used that policy against them. Each doctor received $20,000, and the banks had to set aside money for other victims that may have been affected by this same policy. So Bank of America set aside $100,000, while Cornerstone Mortgage set aside $750,000. Wells Fargo, my bank, was the one that I think set aside the most up to now. It was $6.5 million. They had to pay 75 women $20,000 each. I think the costs have gone up again. So whomever else is going to be caught in this situation will probably have to pay a little more. Elderly housing was started here in 1983. The federal government also has a program called Housing for Older Persons Act. That Housing Act states that there are 2 types of housing, that these housing now have to be built with HUD specification. Back in 1995, people could grandfather in, but now they have to start from scratch, which means that they have to have at least 35 units to start with, and they should be accessible, and they are marketed primarily for either 62 and older, where everyone has to be 62 and older, or 55 and older, where at least one person in 80% of the occupied units can be 55 and older. The others can be, as stated by the property, could be people with disabilities, and it could well be families with children too. Familial status. a lot of times when it's about familial status, it's about the amount of children a person has, or landlords and housing providers kind of, I would say, work from the vibes they get from their residents. And if they're complaining about children, sometimes they put out rules out there. Anytime you put a rule out in a housing community of that is multifamily of 4 units or more, if children is stated in the rule, it means that adults can do what the children cannot do. And that, my friends, is discrimination. So the protection for families with children is for anyone that has minors under the age of 18. This could include the single parents, adoptive parents, grandparents, pregnant women, foster care parents, anyone that is seeking legal custody of a minor. When you make rules, make them about health and safety. When it's about the pool can be about age 15. Why? At age 15, a resident could be a certified lifeguard. Therefore, they won't really need to go to the pool with their parent. So if you say anyone under the age of 15 must be accompanied by an adult, not just parents, so it could be a neighbor, it could be a brother, a sister, it could be any family member, then they would be able to go to the pool. There was one property that wrote a rule, and in the rule you would have thought that they were thinking about the kids playing, but the next sentence in the rule denied anything they could play, including extracurricular activities. I wondered if that included breathing. But here's the best part of it, and I love how fair housing would think about some of these punishments that they deal out. In this case, what they did was to make that property build an accessible playground. If you think about an accessible playground, you're looking at a playground that would allow anyone on there in a wheelchair, in walker, walking with crutches, whatever it be. But that's pretty big playground because it has to support children who are with disabilities or other people with disabilities. So I love some of the ways that they deal out the punishment. So let's talk about source of funds. Source of funds was a big one for 2020. And source of funds have stirred up some of the things that, we knew housing providers would probably talk about. So as of July 1st of 2020, housing providers can no longer deny any type of legitimate source of funds, including housing choice vouchers, formerly known as Section 8, alimony, SSI, SSDI, cash assistance, child support, even unemployment. As long as there is a legal trail to that money, then it is allowed use of it in calculating for the housing, etc. One of the things that came up when source of funds was first added to the Virginia law is that housing providers were asking for 3 times the rent from the prospect that would be moving in. I said it before and I'll say it again. If a person is reaching out to get Section 8 voucher, then you already know they cannot afford that market rent and 3 times. If they could, they would not be looking for housing choice vouchers or help with paying it. So it made absolutely no sense for that housing provider. But at that time, I guess they were trying to make a point. which did not work. The housing provider needs to understand that if that person's part of the rent is zero, then they have to have no income. If their part of the rent is $300 a month, then all they have to show is that they have income of $900 coming in for them to afford that housing. If housing providers are adding extras that they don't ask anyone else for, but just because somebody is using source of funds, you're going to ask them for extra paperwork, then that's not going to work either. The people that are exempt from accepting source of funds is an owner of 4 or less rental dwellings in Virginia, or an owner or entity owning 10% or less of rental units in Virginia. There's also a clause where if that person is not able to pass the inspection, it's a 15-day inspection that they have to use the housing choice voucher, then they can deny the source of funds. But that cannot be the reason every time they're asked to use source of funds, because then we'll know that either that person just doesn't want to accept source of funds or is playing a game. Some of the prohibited acts could include charging more fees for our deposits or rent, denying housing, making it not available just because that person is using source of funds. But one of the most powerful ways is through advertising, because as I tell everyone, when it comes to advertising, advertising would take you out of any type of exemption. So if you may be exempt from the law, but you post on your ad, we don't accept SSR, SSDI payments. We don't take program payments. This unit has not been approved for vouchers or no payment programs, no Section 8. Those things in your ad would take you out of any exemption you have. So advertising would supersede. That's the first of the new ones. The other two that I'm going to talk about now is sexual orientation and gender identity. So under sexual orientation, it's about who you are attracted to. So depending on who you are attracted to, you could be heterosexual, meaning you like the opposite sex, bisexual, meaning you like both sexes, or homosexual, meaning you like the same sex. Gender identity. This is a gender-related identity, appearance, and other gender-related characteristics of that individual with or regards to the designated sex at birth. So basically, this person may have been born male, now lives as a female, because when it comes to sexual orientation, it is about relations of the heart, wherein gender identity is about the brain making that decision of whom you truly are, not because your anatomy says that you are that person. Military status was updated from veteran status that only covered those who had been discharged from the military under nothing less than honorable discharge. So now that it is military status, you are looking at covering anyone that is in the uniformed services. So you have your Navy, your Army, your Air Force, etc. It also covers those in the National Guard, in the Reserve. It covers the Coast Guard. It covers retirees, veterans, and their dependents. So it has broadened it exceptionally. So now we're going to talk about disability, my favorite protected class, the most challenging of the protected classes for housing providers. I think a lot of times housing providers come into the housing, but they don't remove the blinders. And this is about customer service. This is about dealing with anybody from any walk and being able to give them the customer service they deserve. So, it is the protected class with the highest complaints nationwide. I cannot tell you of a time that I have gotten on Fair Housing Coach and haven't seen when they do the press releases. At least if there are 5, there are at least 3 of them that is about disability. So we know that it's definitely an issue. Many once able-bodied individuals went across the ocean to fight for this country. Many of them came back with disabilities, some of them physical, but most. The residuals of the war can be so detrimental to their minds, to their bodies. A lot of times we see homeless people. Many of them served. Many of them are dealing with those disabilities, mental disabilities, PTSD, panic attacks. They've seen horrors that we are thankful that we are not seeing or have not seen in this country, as some of the countries have seen, as Ukraine is dealing with right now. So these guys know what it is like. And when they come back, a lot of times those mental disabilities get them kicked out of housing, and then they're left on the street. And I'm sure if we were to go out and talk to some of them, we will find out that they once served the military and how much they believe in what they do. There's another group that we sometimes ignore too, and that's our children. They have disabilities too. After 9 miscarriages, my daughter had a beautiful set of twins. Idris, I say, is the copulation of all the strong women of the family. Langston is a bright, intelligent young man that has not been talking yet. And when we found that he wasn't talking, which was around 1 going on 2, we reached out to the doctors. Why? Because we were thinking, yep, something is going on. He's not talking while Idris is just talking. And found out that he has a mild case of autism. Is he loved any differently? No. But we know that we're going to have to do things differently for him that we haven't done for Idris, because she's so independent. So our children are residents too. And some of our children come with disabilities. Do they need to know about this law? Absolutely. Absolutely. So the first thing we're going to talk about is what is the definition of disability according to Fair Housing. But Fair Housing was smart. You see, Fair Housing knew that there was a whole other organization that was involved directly with people with individuals with disabilities. So they knew to piggyback on that group, and that group is called the Americans with Disabilities Act. So they already established definition. In fact, they have 3 definitions. So let's look at them. The first definition establishes that the impairment or the condition that the person is dealing with can be either physical or mental. There is no difference between the two. They have the same weight. But what is very important for us to understand is that having that mental or physical impairment doesn't constitute a disability until that impairment substantially limits one or more major life activities. So if we ask what are major life activities, what would you say? What are some major life activities? You can put it in the chat. Try to get you all to go ahead and, be part of this. Major life activities. And I know Sahar could let me know what they wrote in the
Yeah.
chat.
Walking, talking,
Mm-hmm.
paying bills.
Yeah, good one. Mm-hmm. Learning
Sleeping,
is another one. Mm-hmm.
eating, cooking.
Eating, yeah. Mm-hmm. Taking care of yourself. So if any of those is affected because of your condition, then the ADA sees that as a disability. And I'll give you an example. My favorite one is to talk about sugar. Okay. In the South, we don't say diabetes, we say we have the sugar, which means that you have diabetes. So if a person has the sugar, but they are eating well, they are exercising, and they're doing what the doctor tells them to do, more than likely they can maintain that sugar at a level where it should be. So in that case, the law does not look at them as having a disability. Now, when that diabetes caused them to lose their eyesight, or they're now going every week for dialysis because their kidneys are not acting right, or they have lost a limb. Some people lose toes, some people lose a whole leg because of the diabetes and poor circulation. So in that case, the law sees them as a person with disabilities. We had a young lady call one day, and I so happened to answer the phone, and she was upset because her doctor wouldn't sign on her letter that her daughter has a disability. So I said, I hate to ask, but I have to at least answer your question. I said, what is it that your daughter has? And she said, oh, she has asthma. And I said, well, what is it you would like me to do? Because if the doctor is saying that her asthma is not a disability, we can't override the doctor. The doctor already said it's not a disability. Well, she hung up on me, but I tried to explain to her what it takes for it to show as being a disability. A record of having such an impairment. Now, one of the things that I've said is that if you have a resident that has a nervous breakdown, something happened, it triggers something in them. They screamed, they hollered that night, made a lot of noise, maybe broke a few things in the apartment, and that person, is then kicked off that apartment. The next person that is going to request some kind of referral, how was this person when they were living there with you? If they were to say something like, oh yeah, when they were living here, they tore up the apartment, made it so bad we had to evict them, and that was based on their disability, that's a problem. Because one of the things that the law says is that a person has to be a clear and present threat of substantial harm to people or property. Clear and present makes it where you cannot use what that person did a year or months ago as a way to verify them to come into the property. The last one is the one that I love, because it says that even if a person doesn't have a disability, but is regarded, is seen, is perceived as someone with a disability, and in doing so, they are discriminated against, that person can file a complaint based on disability without having a disability. Me and my bald head will have people come up to me and say, "Oh, you know, a survivor?" No, I am a person that chose to rock the bald head because I could. So, I mean, I have no problem with them asking. I just don't, I don't talk things into existence. So, I'm like, yeah, I just chose to shave my head, and this is my persona. That's all. But if they were to discriminate against me in housing, I could file a complaint. And they would handle that complaint under disability for me. So, the fair housing equalizers for individuals with disability. I started working in 2003, and much of what I was seeing opened my eyes so much that I really started taking in the details. Many of those who came to my classes in person would be asked, "Are you a first time fair housing attendee, a fair housing virgin?" And I would say to them, "Can you tell me what anyone told you about fair housing?" And they would say, "Oh, they told me that at some point I'm going to go to a class." Or they said, "Just wait, Miss Molly gonna teach you fair housing." And in some cases, some of them had no information about fair housing. When they were sent to the class was the first time they even found out about it. Another shocking thing was meeting folks that had been in the business for years and I had never had a fair housing class. And I'm not talking 1 year or 2 year, I'm talking 30 years in the business and never had a fair housing class. But what anyone working in housing have to understand is that able-bodied people and people with disabilities have the same right, that their rights are the same, even. But in order to do that, in order to give them the type of service that's going to make things equal for them, this is one of those situations, as stated by Sandra Day O'Connor, one of our past Supreme Court justices, while arguing about affirmative action, which she would say I am not crazy about, but yet she benefited from, because had it not been for affirmative action, she would not be a Supreme Court justice. Then, it says here, you have to treat, in some situations, individuals in an unequal way for them to have equal use. This is one of those occasions. So, with landlords and housing management companies saying that you had to, treat everyone exactly the same, well, that's not true. In order for people with disabilities to have equal use and enjoyment of their home, the property, and all of the amenities that come with that property, the Fair Housing Act and the Virginia Fair Housing Law didn't ask, didn't request, it demand that housing providers make reasonable accommodations and reasonable modifications. Let's understand these two different changes. Let's talk about reasonable accommodations. Can anybody tell me what their definition of reasonable accommodations is. Did we get some answers, Mr. Ha?
No, I'm waiting.
Okay.
Asking for an amendment or allowing a change to a policy due to disability.
Yeah, disability. Good one. Who is that?
Blur. And
Nice.
also no fundamental operational change. And I've got another one from Christopher, large print accessible documents.
Yeah, that could be an accommodation. Yep.
Allowing
Yep.
an emotion support animal and service animal.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. He's given examples. Very good. Okay, so let me tell you what the law says about reasonable accommodation. What is a reasonable accommodation? So a reasonable accommodation is a change to any rule, any policy, any practice, or any service. That change is going to allow the person with the disability to have equal use and enjoyment of their dwelling unit or common space. When a housing provider is asked about a reasonable accommodation, they have to do everything they can to assist that person, unless it meets the definition of an unreasonable accommodation, which we would talk about. When a person is asking for a reasonable accommodation, it could be necessary at any stage of living in housing, because a disability doesn't make a date with you, and a disability doesn't discriminate. It can hit anybody. We've seen that with COVID. It didn't say, hey, you ready for me? It just hit people, unfortunately. Now, one of the things that they let you know is that reasonable accommodation can be necessary in any of the stages of housing. When a person is applying for housing, if they are not able to read or write because they may have dyslexia, then that person may need help in filling out the application. More than likely, they're going to bring someone with them, and that person should be able to help them to fill out the application. When it comes to tenancy, a person may have a stroke while living on the property. That stroke has now paralyzed them on one side of their body. That means that if they were living on the third floor and their stairwells up there, more than likely they may not be able to navigate those steps. So even before maybe being released from the hospital, family members may be saying, you know what, we're going to have to get a reasonable accommodation to be released out of this lease so that we can find a better place for him to live, and he can be on one floor or whatever it may be. The one that most interested me, and I tell you, you have to read sometimes and do a lot of deep searching. But it says here, to prevent eviction. And one of the things that they talked about when they talk about preventing eviction is that before a person is evicted for maybe misconduct or something of the sort, you need to first ask the tenant if they have a disability. Because if you knew or should have known, and today Sarah Pratt gave examples of how you could have known if that person is on SSI, SSDI, if that person is not is getting their source of a fund completely paid. Some of these things are indication that they have a disability. So before you evict them, you have to ask them if they have a disability and if there is something that the property could do to enable them to continue to be a resident there. If you evict them and then it's found that they have a disability, that client can come back and sue that property for not putting them through the process as HUD has stated. The Virginia Fair Housing Law states that is a change to rules, policies, services, or practices. Mainly, they're looking at paper changes as reasonable accommodations. The thing about it is, if we have any properties that are also regulated under Section 504 of the 1973 Rehabilitation Act, those properties are also going to be added on. And those properties are going to have to extend their service into structural changes. So federally funded properties are not only taking care of paper changes, they are also going to take care of structural changes. So your public housing units, they're going to do whatever change that person with a disability needs. Any organization that is funded by the federal government, when it comes to housing, they have to do the same. Why is this so important to know? Private properties, paper changes. There's one that we need to talk about. Parking spaces. We had a case where the Virginia Supreme Court Justice decided that parking space that needed some, work done to it, maybe curb walk, painting the aisle, all of that, would be considered a reasonable modification. When HUD got a hold of this information, they were hot because the very first thing that HUD has on their document that is called the joint statement between DOJ and HUD about reasonable accommodations, the first example is about parking spaces. And they say, even though there may be some adjustment done to the parking spaces, you may lose a parking space, you're going to have to paint the aisle, you put up the sign, that is not considered a modification. It is a reasonable accommodation because you cannot give a person a parking space to get into their home, right in front of their home, but yet they have to walk all the way down to the end of the aisle or the sidewalk just to get back to where they were. You have not accommodated them. So Virginia Supreme Court had to reverse that ruling quickly. Federally funded properties take care of all changes. And the reason why it's important to know this is because no resident should be paying for a reasonable accommodation. The responsibility of paying for that reasonable accommodation falls on the housing provider, not on the resident. Sarah Pratt said today that there were many who were charging deposits for animals or charging for them to park. They're in certain spaces. They had to pay extra money to park there. So these are things that the housing provider should be handling, not the resident. Now, the way the process works is that if there is a resident with a disability and they need to have a reasonable accommodation, they have to first meet the definition of disabilities according to the ADA. We already discussed that previously. The next thing is that the law says that if you can see the disability and you know the relationship between the disability and the request, then there's no reason for the resident to have to bring any kind of verification. For example, that housing provider knew from the beginning when they moved in that, this person has a disability, maybe because of their financing that they have. Over the time, they decided, maybe certain things they need help with, this dog can be trained to do. So they bring the dog in. That dog, that person knew they had a disability. That person may have been told certain things about the disability. So now the housing provider knows. So they shouldn't be asking that resident to bring them more verification. Now, if the provider doesn't know about a disability, or they find out when that person has a dog living there and the person brings up that they have a disability and that dog is there for that disability, if the housing provider can't see the relationship or see the disability, then they can ask them to bring verification. It tells you here, remember that the threshold for showing causation is very low, which means that certain questions you cannot ask. You should not know what the disability is, what kind of treatment they're getting. All of that is falling under the HIPAA law. According to the law, the request must be reasonable. We'll talk about what's unreasonable in a minute. One of the things that they do encourage is the interactive discussion. In this case, whenever someone asks for reasonable accommodation, the answer should never be no. It may be, let me think this over. Let me run this through my legal department. I will get back to you later on today or tomorrow in a couple of days, whatever it be. You also need to have that conversation with that resident, because in talking to that resident, sometimes they can clarify what they're actually looking for. And in some cases, the landlord may be able to give another option, as long as the landlord understands that when they put out their option, it is up to the resident needing the accommodation to decide which option they would go with. If the request is reasonable that they're asking the landlord about, and it would alleviate the problem, then that landlord, if they do not meet that request, they could be running a risk of violating the fair housing law. So what would be considered an unreasonable accommodation? Someone kind of mentioned some of it, but let's talk in depth. According to the law, unless that accommodation pose an undue financial and administrative hardship, you will have to make the accommodation. Now, what do they mean by undue financial and administrative hardship? It means that you have to be very broke. Means that you could be thrown in the red because of that accommodation, and you are too busy to make it. It is an and, it's not an or. So you would have to be too busy and too broke to make the accommodation. The other reason is that whatever that resident may be asking would fundamentally alter the nature of the program. What do we mean by that? It means that the resident is being asked to do something that is outside of what the program was conceived to do. In this case, we're talking housing. So if a resident wanted the housing provider to send the maintenance man up to go to the store for them and to go ahead and buy their grocery, and once they buy their grocery, they want them to go ahead and put the groceries up, then In a case like that, a housing provider would say, that is not a service that we provide, but let me, tell you about Instacart. You have many of these supermarkets that actually have a service that they could bring the delivery to you, or you go by and pick up the delivery. And if that's something that we could help you to get started, it would be something that we would do, especially when you're in the elderly communities too. So according to what HUD has stated, no is not an answer for a reasonable accommodation. There should always be some type of sourcing that you could do, or pointing to a resource that could help them to get exactly what they need. So they just don't want you to go, oh, no, we can't. They don't want housing providers to tell you, oh, no, that's not something we could do. No, oh, heck no, no. If that's the case, then they have not entered into that interactive process with you. So they would need to do that. Here are some examples of reasonable accommodations. The most popular, the one that seems to turn so many housing providers' heads, is the assistance, emotional support, and companion animals. How many of you have clients with them? And you just think about it. How many have clients? How many of you go into the stores nowadays and you see somebody walking around with an animal? Yeah, and I do agree. Not everyone is probably telling the truth, but those lies come to bite them later. I have a friend that is a housing provider, and she has service animals. And one of her service animals was going on a plane with her. As they were passing by, she spotted a Rottweiler and knew from the behavior of the Rottweiler that it really wasn't a service animal, but the owner said they were. As she was passing by with one of her animals, that service animal grabbed it. And he's one of my favorite guys. He's such a sweet guy. So over the time, he developed PTSD, and now he's getting older. He's, a little senile and everything like that. But having that dog attack him was also, traumatic to him. So in the end, you find that that person really isn't telling the truth. So let me introduce you to some of these animals and tell you a little bit about them. Most times people call them service animals, but not all animals are service animals. There are only 2 animals that have been relegated and limited by ADA as service animals. In one of the cases, what happened was you had this gentleman that went into a Burger King or one of the fast food restaurants, and he had a boa constrictor around his neck. He told them in the restaurant that the boa constrictor was his service animal. He said that this animal would squeeze his neck to indicate that he's going to have a seizure. And that way he would know to, relax or sit down or whatever, so that he wouldn't fall or hit his head or something of the sort. Well, it might be true, but oh my gosh, taking a snake into a restaurant, nah. The ADA got a little nervous about that and decided that only dogs would be service animals. And the community of people with disabilities also wanted one other animal recognized, and I think they were successful with it, and that's the miniature horse. So we know dogs have been around for a long time. They became the very first service animals, and they were usually helping someone that was blind. Well, over the years, these dogs have expanded their use. They help people with panic attacks, epilepsy, diabetes, cancer. Oh my gosh, so many different things. The thing about dogs is that after a certain age, they have to be retired. And I often worried about them because I thought, okay, when you retire them, what do they do? Like send them to a pasture and just keep them there, or does the person keep them? And in many cases, the person would keep them and then get the other dog because they already are so attached that they would get the other dog and just wait for the older one to live its life out as happily as possible, even in their old age. Now, the horse, again, started out being an animal that assisted those who were blind. But the horse is now an animal that is assisting those in wheelchairs. They can pull them around, especially when they get tired. The people in the little people community have asked them to modify the size of the horse. They wanted an animal that was sturdy enough and at their level that they could lean on for support. You know, a lot of the folks with that are little people have spine and neck and leg problems. And so these animals sometimes are an awesome help to them. There is Zane, a young boy in Alaska, and he has an autoimmune system that eventually his muscles will turn to mush and he will not be able to do the things that he's able to do now. So his mom wants him to walk for as much as he can walk and be active for as much as he can. So he has a horse that goes to school with him. So you can always Google Zane with the mini horse in Alaska, and you will see his story. Now, as I said, service animals are limited to dogs and horses. But when it comes to assistance, emotional support, and companion animals, these animals can be any animal. So we have the monkey. And I think the monkey inevitably going to become a service animal because the monkey is actually the hands and feet for people that have lost the ability to use their hands and feet. This gentleman here has the same type of disease as Zane does from Alaska, and he outlived the range that they told him. You know, they said he was going to live to about 14. At the time of this picture, he was about 34. And he said that his wife agreed to at least letting them have the monkey. And he said, you know, sometimes everything goes really well, but then there are times when the monkey has her own little attitude. So if he asks her to change the channel on the TV, she may do it, but if there's something on that TV that she wants to watch, she's going to sit down, cross her leg, watch the show until it's over or the commercial or whatever it is, and then she would continue to change the channel for him. And he said, you know, in this case, she's the one that's going to win because she's the one that can move around. These monkeys can open doors, turn on light, pick things up off the floor, get the telephone, get food out of the refrigerator, warm it up. They are amazing. Somebody wrote something right there, Mr. Howard. What did she say? I had a person.
Uh,
Oh,
I have several questions actually, but I didn't want to interrupt you.
okay.
So the question is the law the same for a landlord as it is for a condo association?
Yes, ma'am. Absolutely. Condo got to follow the same laws. Condo, a lot of times, homeowners association and condominium association feel like their bylaws are the law. No, they're not. You still have to deal with state and federal law, and those supersede any kind of laws, you know, that you may have in your condominium or homeowners association. So if a person needs an animal there, even if you have the rule that you do not allow animals or you know, pets, this is a whole different situation. This is about a person's health. So whether it be mental or physical, and they have to be allowed to have the animal there.
Well, I think that question back to the reasonable accommodation. Uh,
Uh-huh.
but I have another question. Who speaks to property managers about accepting HCV holders?
The housing choice vouchers, you don't have to talk to them. You go and you apply.
Hmm.
And when you apply, and if they give you any runaround about it, then you let them know that you know the law and you will be calling the Fair Housing Office.
Okay. And the last one, don't want to interrupt you. Do state colleges and universities need to follow fair housing laws?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I had a young lady that debated that back and forth with me because her manager at in the program, you know, they have the Virginia Tech has a program for housing providers too. And she was saying that he told her that, you know, it doesn't regulate dorms. It does. And you spend more time in your dorm than you spend at home. So it does. And let me just give you an example. A young lady was going to University of Kentucky at Kearney. Her husband was supposed to be a professor, but she was going to be a student and requested that she bring her miniature pincher that alerts her when she's going to have a panic attack and gets on her lap, puts a paw on each shoulder, looks her in the eye, it calms her down. When she told the housing provider that was in charge about it, they said that she was only being a spoiled child and wanted to have her dog there. She told them that this could, you know, turn into a lawsuit that could go to court. And they told her, oh, they didn't care because they thought they were going to win. It was a settlement of $140,000. Can we say free schooling? Yes, we can. Okay, so I'm going to continue. Sadie. Sadie is the African gray parrot. Sadie's um, companion or his master is Mr. Eggers. Mr. Eggers has bipolar disorder. And what happens is he said sometimes he'll get so angry he would do things that he shouldn't, like pour hot coffee on one of his neighbors' heads. So he felt that if he had a parrot, the parrot would mimic him and talk him out of these psychotic episodes. So he would stand in the mirror and tell himself that he loves himself, and he would count and he would do the breathing exercise and different things. So Sadie, hearing him, let me just say that Sadie was the cussing bird. She used to drop the F bomb on a regular basis. So they had hidden her in a storage, and she became so, you know, depressed that she was pulling the feathers out of her own body. So by the time Mr. Eggers got her, she was one ugly bird. But he took care of her and she would hear him. So now, without any, I guess, any type of alert, Sadie would know that he's going to have a psychotic episode. And she would say, I love you. It's okay. Let's calm down. Let's breathe now. And she would talk him through the psychotic episode so that he wouldn't go out and do anything mean to anybody. Let me just say that when I first heard about Sadie, I was like a service bird. But then when I started hearing the story, and he even documents the story in his own voice, Mr. Eggers does, then I was like, oh yeah, okay. So the bird travels in a cage that's in a backpack on him at all times. We had a young lady at one of our universities here in Virginia call us one day upset because she had done her research, gave the school all the information that was needed because she wanted to have her guinea pig at school. The guinea pig knew when she would have a panic attack and would crawl up her shoulder and purr in her ear. She was going home several times a week just to get a fix from her guinea pig. So once, you know, she gave us that call, one of the fair housing gurus called the school and had to give them a quick education about it not looking too good if Virginia has to sue a Virginian entity. And because you have deprived this young lady of her right to have that guinea pig there. In fact, her roommates were fine with having the guinea pig. Now, I know you all see that cute picture of me on the floor. I am with Tucker the pig. If you have not heard about Tucker the pig in Virginia, he lived in Brandermill. And one of the neighbors, I guess, got a hold of the fact that there was a pig in the neighborhood and reported them to the supervisors in Chesterfield. Well, those supervisors also got a real quick lesson on reasonable accommodations. And immediately, all that they were talking about, the board will vote on this tonight, that was gone. Tucker came into this family because they lost a child to cancer. And that loss was so intense for them. They wanted to do it holistically. Unfortunately, they were very allergic to dogs. And someone probably whispered that potbelly pigs were real cool and told them that Tucker would only be 90 pounds of pig. Tucker is actually 250 pounds, but he's an amazing pig. The family has now moved to Parrot, and I would be very interested in finding out if they went ahead and started their own pig farm. So those are some of the animals. One of the animals that people would talk about often too with housing providers are the therapy animals. But there's a glitch to this one. You see, the therapy animals are usually trained by a handler, and then that handler would take them into different settings, maybe an elderly community or a nursing home. So one of the things that they found is that therapy animals are not considered service animals according to the ADA. They said that some states have laws defining therapy animals. I have to check to see if Virginia has any of those laws. These animals are not only for people with disabilities, and we have seen that. I know you all have been in the hospital, and a lot of times they found that having these animals around calms people down. I know that I have the white coat syndrome. My pressure will go up the minute I walk into that hospital. It doesn't matter whether I'm visiting somebody or I'm going to get some type of, procedure done. But what they are saying is whenever we take these animals around, they help anybody, not necessarily only people with disabilities. So because of that, they are not covered under any federal law. So if someone says, this is a therapy dog, unless Virginia has recognized therapy animals, then these would be animals that a person is training to help someone else, not for themselves. And the law actually says that if the animal is allowed to be on the property, the animal must provide a necessary service for the resident in order for it to be a reasonable accommodation. So that person would be training the animal to help other people, not to help themselves. Therefore, it would not be a reasonable accommodation for them to have that animal as a therapy animal. So they would pay for that animal as they would a pet. Under the law, once a person shows all what they need to show, the resident is not required to pay any deposit or rent for the animal. What they look at the animal as is as one with that person. So let's say the person has multiple sclerosis and they can't use their arms and legs. That monkey becomes the arms and legs for that person with the disability. Therefore, you don't see them and their monkey, you see them. The monkey is part of them. If the disability isn't obvious, the resident may be asked to provide some type of verification that the animal is necessary and related to the disability. There is no limit on the size, the breed, or the weight of the animal. One of the things we talked about today is that in many cases, you have properties that would tell you that their insurance company doesn't even accept Rottweilers, German Shepherds, Doberman Pinschers, Pit Bulls. They forgot one on that list, and that's the Chihuahua. Now, ADA tells you there are no vicious breeds. There are vicious animals in any breed. So what a housing provider needs to do is focus on the behavior of the animal, that particular animal, and not put it as a breed. The other thing is insurance companies have to provide reasonable accommodations too. So that housing provider can ask the insurance company to make that reasonable accommodation for that resident. And if the insurance company does not provide the reasonable accommodation, then the housing provider and the resident can sue the insurance company. In many cases, they found that some of the housing providers didn't even call the insurance company. They are so used to just saying things like, oh, the insurance company wouldn't allow it. But I don't know if they don't realize it, but we actually do an investigation. And that insurance company would be called. And if they're asked, did so-and-so call you and ask you about, XYZ? And they say no, oh well, you didn't do what the law says you needed to do, and that is to call the insurance company and ask them for that reasonable accommodation for your residents. The animal must not be a threat to other individuals or to the property. If the animal is being a threat, then again, you're focusing on the behavior, and you're going to ask the owner to please modify the behavior of the animal, or you may have to ask them to take the animal off the property. This is based on a 2130. So if they go and they get the animal trained and the behavior is better, then the 2130 goes and the person is allowed to be there. If the behavior of the animal hasn't changed, then you address that with them and you let them know what steps you may have to take. I will tell you that there are some people that are going to feel that that animal is their love, that's all they have, and they would want to be released from the lease if the animal is going to be moved off the property. There may be rules in place, but housing providers may have to grant subsequent reasonable accommodations. One of the things that they talked about was the poop, the animal pooping and expecting residents to clean it up. What if that resident can't clean it up? They said that courts have mandated that if you have maintenance personnel, personnel can clean it up for them because that person can't at the time. So even when they come up with excuses about not allowing the animal there, the courts will come up with many remedies for that. Management may require verification if disability isn't visible, but inform your clients also that they will be responsible for any damages above and beyond normal wear and tear. If they've been there for a while, and when they talk about carpeting and all that, then you know that carpeting is going to change because they've been there for a while, okay? But if they just moved in and 2 years later the carpet is all torn up, then yeah, of course, you have to do what you have to do. So we have two different guidances. We have the one from HUD and we have the one from the Virginia Real Estate Board. They issued, each issued their own guidances on the animals, assistance, emotional support, and companion animals. There's also a fact sheet, and I think I'll add all of that to the end of this presentation that I'll send to Sahar, and that way she can share with you all. The other disability that took many by surprise was chronic hoarding. Chronic hoarding became a big topic. In fact, we started back in 2011. I approached my boss because after watching one of the episodes with rats, and this man was crying because one rat was had died, and he was begging the rat to forgive him, and he would sleep in an office that is not connected to the house, just because if he slept in his bed, the rats would be biting on his head. So he had to move into this house to sleep. But this dude was like, it was almost like the movie Ben. You could put the food down on the floor and the rats would come out of everywhere. They chewed up all his electrical. But all this came from him losing his wife, whom he loved, and he was devastated by her loss. And I remember saying to my sister-in-law, who is a psychologist, I said, I think that hoarding is a disability. And she said, yeah, well, it's OCD. I said, I don't think so. OCD people tend to be more manic about cleaning. This is a different situation. So how many of you know what hoarding truly is? Is it just having a bunch of stuff? You can put it in in the chat. Is it only about having lots of stuff in the house? Or is it something else? Can anyone tell me? Anybody? Give it a shot. In fact, I could ask, how many of you think you're hoarding? I know a lot of husbands out there go, man, my wife is hoarding. She's got a lot of shoes and bags and there's no place to put. Did we get any answers?
No, not yet.
Okay. Y'all shy. Here's the deal. Hoarding is not just having a lot of stuff. It is the inability to get rid of any of it, no matter how insignificant it may be. A glass may have a chip. You go into the home of someone that is hoarding. You say, well, this glass has a chip. Why don't you throw it away? They said, no, I can drink out of it. It's fine. It doesn't bother me. If you have a piece of paper towel, and that paper towel may look like this at the time, but then they take that paper towel and they open it up and try to smooth it out. No, I can use it again. See, it'll pick something up. They will find an excuse for everything. So in 2013, after much research, the DSM-5, or the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disabilities, made chronic hoarding a true disability. You can see it in cases like this, these two pictures. Another thing about hoarding is rooms that are designed for certain, what you would say, designed for use in a certain way is not being used. Like you look at the toilet here, it's surrounded by so many things. That toilet seat is so black, it probably doesn't have any water in it. So it has not been used, and it's storing a lot more stuff in there. You look at the kitchen. The kitchen has stuff everywhere, on top, below, even the stove. You wonder if she's cooking because there's so much stuff on the stove. So she can't even use the stove for what it is designed to use for. So what they have found is that 6% of the world's population is involved in hoarding. I really and truly thought it was only a US thing because we have abundance of things here that, I think everyone feels like everything is valuable. Anyone can be a hoarder, men, women, or children. Children are going to follow what they see in the home, or they'll go to the complete opposite. They become minimalist instead of hoarders. Elderly women are more likely to hoard. If these women lived through the Depression era, oh my goodness, that was traumatic for them. Many went through hunger. Many had very little to wear. So now that things are better, they are always prepared that if something happens, they will have. You also have those aunts and grandmothers and mothers that will give you things. And when you finally convince them to give you, they want to know every time you come by to visit, well, where's the brooch I gave you? And I have to remind them, when you give something away, I know you're giving it away because you love the person or you want them to have something from you, but you can't dictate what they do with it. They're not nasty. They're not lazy. They're not defiant. What these folks are dealing with is some type of trauma. And because of this trauma, they have resorted to hoarding. Things don't leave them unless they want to get rid of it. Things don't talk back. Things don't hurt them. That's how they feel. So if they felt like they lost control, this is the control that they hold on to. Even though they are not going to ask the housing provider for a reasonable accommodation, the housing provider have eyes and have enough understanding of what hoarding looks like, that if they see it, they should know that immediately they are going to have to give a reasonable accommodation. And that reasonable accommodation is not for them to have more storage area or for them to move to a bigger apartment. It is for them to work with the housing provider to clean up and bring the unit to code as it should be. One of the things you get to rely on is the part of the law that says that housing has to have good housekeeping. So you need to keep the unit up to code. Now, when it comes to being proactive, what I say to housing providers is that they have once a year to do inspections of the unit. During that inspection, not only should the housing provider look at things that need to be addressed, but that housing provider needs to listen to the resident, tell them about things that also need to be addressed, and it should give them that time to address those things and bring them up to code also. So that resident is going to be, getting that inspection, but then there are 4 other times that personnel can also see what is taking place, and that's during the changing of those HVAC units. Housing providers should be doing those changes, not the resident. So maintenance need to be reminded that they need to be on top of this. 4 times a year, every change of season should be a time for changing the filters in the HVAC unit. It takes a community. This is not an easy thing to deal with, but I have had several of my housing provider tell me about them having success once they took the class and learned how to make the plan and make the plan go into effect. Now, when it comes to reasonable modifications, this is a different ballgame. Reasonable modifications are structural changes to the unit where the person lives, or it could be in those public and common use areas. As you can see, this young lady going into the house, if there are several people living in the building, then she would not be the only one using that lift. Others would use that lift also. A person that is nervous about getting out of because they have maybe mobility issues or have fallen several times, they had a stroke, whatever it may be, grab bars are going to be a very necessary thing for them to keep them safe, to hold on to. Ramps. Ramps are so flexible now. They make them in different ways, wooden ramps, aluminum ramps. And in some cases, the house is made in a way that you would have to put a ramp up in order for the person to have entry and exit out of the house. And, here's another type of ramp. It's a wooden ramp that they put up there also. So when it comes to reasonable modifications, here's how it works. As we said before, it's a physical change to structure a building or dwelling and common use areas. When it comes to modifications, they must be, allowed at any time of tenancy, because a person doesn't know when they're going to have an illness or when they're going to need one. As with reasonable accommodations, they expect the modifications to also be reasonable. Lastly, is the most important bullet. Unlike reasonable accommodations, structural changes in privately funded properties are the financial responsibility of the resident, not the housing provider. The housing provider can be involved in making sure that the person doing the work is a licensed contractor, and that if anything happened, they can also get some type of justice for that. We at Department of Professional and Occupational Regulation have what is called the Victims Fund. So in the case of someone being taken or duped by a contractor or something of the sort, you can file a complaint. And if you win your complaint, there are funds in the victim fund to repay that person. Now, what can the housing provider do? The housing provider can also say to the resident, you know what, I see what type of materials you want to use, but can we use this other material for it? We just think with the aesthetic of the property, it would look better. Now, they can do that with the understanding that if that material costs more than the resident was going to invest in the material, then that housing provider has to pay the difference between what was going to be used and what needs to be used now. And that housing provider will pay the difference. So these are some ways. Now, there's another thing to this modification. There are times when the next resident will not need the modification that was made. It is not going to be every modification, because if you widen the door, you're not going to make that door narrow again. But let's say you lifted up the vanity so that the person using the unit would be able to get their wheelchair under there. If the next person is not going to need that vanity raised up, then the person using it now would have to restore the modification back to what it was. It's going to cost them just as much to restore it as it did to modify it. So they can also always allow that resident to have an escrow account. Besides paying their rent, they can pay money into the escrow account, and at the end of tenancy, that money is returned to them. And if there's any interest on it, that interest is returned to them so that they can restore the property. There is added protection for people with disabilities, and that added protection came from the Olmstead Act. For many years, families would have children with disabilities, and those children, on the advice of the doctor, would be placed in homes or institutions, better say. We've seen documentaries about those institutions where a lot of people did not get, a lot of those who were there did not get the type of attentions that they should have. So over the years, they've been looking into this. And with, Hollywood is showing how people with Down syndromes can live a very normal life, and people with, mental disabilities can go to work, can come home and cook their own foods. One of the things that they push for is to get these folks out of these warehouses of institutions and put them into communities where they can be part of the community just like anyone else. So it was a big uproar when they started talking about group homes. In fact, here in the Richmond area, we had a case several years ago, and it was amazing how this case even came in to awareness of our office. And it was a reporter that was at the meeting. It was a homeowners meeting and was documenting what was said. And everything that was said was documented. So this case wasn't a hard case to investigate because everything said negatively about group homes was involved in that document. It resulted in them having to pay the group home, the cost of the group home, because they were saying things like these folks would get out and what if they kill somebody? And it was all because one of the group home residents touched the foot of one of the residents. It was something about him and feet, and that person had their feet up on the, I guess the porch. And so he touched their feet maybe to put it down or whatever, and it became a big issue. So group homes are all over Virginia. In fact, Virginia, I believe, got in a little trouble because they weren't getting folks out of group homes as quickly as they should. And I believe they paid something like a $27 million fine. And that money was used to house a lot. There is a young lady that she explained to me that in looking at group homes, she thought, yeah, they're nice, but it's still like staff taking care of them. And she said, I wish one of them would think about buying a home to see a person with disability buy a home and live the life like anyone else. So I have a group home at the end of my cul-de-sac. And I'll never forget when they first brought it. And when we moved into the neighborhood, it was a policeman living there. And that policeman sold his home to a group home. And when they were coming in, my late husband at the time was working at the YMCA and got a lot of questions. Hey, Ralph, so there's a group home in your neighborhood. Did you give your approval for them to be there? And my husband, my late husband, knowing at the time that he was married to the fair housing trainer, knew exactly what he needed to do. And he said, well, when I moved in my community, they didn't tell anyone we were moving in. And the person said, but don't you want to know if there's anything wrong with them? And he said, well, when I moved into the neighborhood, they didn't ask me if anything was wrong with me. And I know there's a whole lot, but they didn't ask me. And she looked at him and she says, I guess I should shut up, huh? And he smiled. See, sometimes you don't have to argue. You just have to lay reality out. And if they didn't ask us about our disabilities, then they don't get to ask anybody about their disabilities. Group homes shall be considered for all purposes residential occupancy by a single family when construing any restrictive covenant which purports to restrict or occupancy or ownership of real or leasehold property to members of a single family or to residential use or structure. I believe there is a case taking place somewhere in the northern part of the state. well, it's not a case. It came to fruition because zoning folks knew what they needed to do. But you oftentimes have people in homeowners association usually complaining, and they have to understand that a complaint like that can result in a lawsuit had they not come to an agreement. So even though, you know, you're talking about Virginia, you still have the federal and local and state laws that you have to abide by. And what I just read to you about group homes is in our law. So you have to follow it. Anything before I get into the process of how to file a complaint and all that, does anybody have any questions?
Miss Mally, I added two links to the chat box about how to file a complaint with your office, and also the contact form in case
Yeah.
if folks have any questions and they want to send a question and ask.
Okay, perfect. So I would just then explain to you that when it comes to the complaint process, these are the folks that you can actually file your complaints with. You can file it with HUD, which is Department of Housing and Urban Development. They're kind of like our bosses, because what we do, they monitor. When I say we, it's the FAP, the Fair Housing Assistance Program. You have two different entities that are FAPs here in Virginia. You have the Virginia Fair Housing Office, which is in Richmond in the West End, and you have Fairfax County Fair Housing Office, that's up north, and they handle all the complaints for Fairfax County. So if it's anywhere in Virginia, except for Fairfax, it'll come to our office, and it would be sent by HUD or the DOJ. If it's happening in Fairfax County, it would go to the Fairfax County office from HUD. Now, there are times when HUD and the DOJ, which is the Department of Justice, they may hold on to a case because they feel like they can get a better outcome from that case, or make it an example to housing providers. The FIPS, those are the Fair Housing Initiative Programs, and I usually refer to them as the private sector of fair housing. Unlike our office, they are able to bring the complaints, and they have the power to advocate for those who are filing the complaints. In cases of time, if I'm speaking to someone and they're not able to maybe grasp what I'm trying to explain to them to do, my recommendation is usually for them to call Housing Opportunities Made Equal, aka HOME. HOME will assist you with it and will fight all the way through till they get solution to the problem. So that's your another choice that you have. Federal courts, state and local courts, they are also there for you. The way it works is that if a person goes somewhere, and I tell folks, if you are scratching your head when you leave out of that person's office, wondering what the heck just happened, call somebody and talk to them about it. More than likely, call one of our offices and ask. Call HUD, call our office, call the Fairfax County office, or call Housing Opportunities Made Equal. Somebody gonna talk to you. Now, when you file that complaint, what happens is we would have to see if we have jurisdiction over it. Is it a complaint based on discrimination, and is it based on what we cover? So once we establish that, and we do have jurisdiction, that complaint takes two avenues. One of them is to the investigator that will be assigned the complaint. They are to investigate in an unbiased way. The other goes to the alternate dispute resolution section. They are tasked with bringing both parties together to see if they can come to an amicable agreement. If that is possible, then we do not have to investigate anymore. We go with the agreement and they would have to follow it to the letter of the law. If they cannot come to an agreement, then the investigation continues until a final investigative report is submitted to the Fair Housing and/or Real Estate boards. Those boards are comprised with individuals, both in the housing community and civilians, that are tasked with looking at these complaints to decide whether or not there is any evidence of discrimination taking place. If there's none, it is no cause. If there is, it is a cause case. Once it becomes a cause case, it now goes to the Attorney General's office, where the attorney assigned to handle all the fair housing cases is now tasked with either getting conciliation or taking it all the way to court until either the jury or the judge makes a decision. Once that decision is made, whatever is the judgment for the plaintiff, that plaintiff gets that judgment. The office gets paid for the work that they do. And, you know, the person has to follow whatever the judge or the jury has mandated them to do. That's in the first year. If that individual that was discriminated against allows the first year to pass, they still have another year, but this time they would have to either find a private lawyer to help them with the case or take the case to court themselves. And, you know, whatever they get as a judgment or a settlement, they would either have to, you know, share with the lawyer or with whomever helped them through the court case. So you actually have 2 years. Again, the first year, one of the FAPs or the FIPS can deal with it. By the second year, you will be with someone that is in the civil side of the law. We did have a case once that, you know, I am always looking for cases that I can use as examples. And we had one in, I think it was the western part of Virginia. And we had a young lady that moved into an apartment with her husband. The landlord apparently took a liking to her. And while, you know, he was trying to get rid of the husband, trying to get the husband in trouble, once he got, you know, try to get the husband kicked off the property. And then one of the things that he did was to go into her apartment whenever no one was home, but the neighbors saw him and she started missing things out of her drawers and stuff like that. It was him. She didn't bring her case to our office. It was a lawyer that helped her with the case. And I think it was almost $15,000 in a settlement or the judgment from the courts. And she had to split that with her lawyer. So the Federal Fair Housing Act and the Virginia Fair Housing Law also adds penalties to their settlements and judgments. One of the things that we know for a fact is that when it comes to fair housing, there are no caps. The sky is the limit. Judges would add, you know, in many cases, they would ask the plaintiff, how did this affect you? And that plaintiff may say, you know, I get migraine headaches. I now have to take medication. I'm now seeing all these psychologists. All of that they would take into consideration. Though the judgment and settlements can be high, not every case is going to result in a big cash flow. And that's what I try to tell folks too. We've had plaintiffs that would not accept a dime. What they wanted to do was to get their point across and have the changes made. Even though in some cases they have the opportunity to maybe get quite a wind flow, they don't. One of the things that happened in the last year or so, I think 2 years now, is that when it came to civil penalties, they were running between $10,000 and $74,000, depending on how many times you violated fair housing. As of April of 2020, it went up to 21,400 and some dollars between that and 105,000, I think it is, or 7,000 and some dollars. So it went up exponentially. So to violate fair housing, any housing provider violating fair housing has to know that it's going to be costly to them. The thing about fair housing is they know what will hurt housing providers. And so every time you violate the law, you're going to pay more and you're going to pay more. So it is now your time to ask questions about any concerns that you have or any questions you may have. If
Thank
not,
you, Miss Malley. Actually, I have a question.
yes, ma'am.
We are almost like 15 minutes past our time, but
Yeah.
I have a question. Christopher asked, can the petitioner request for a lawyer from the courts if they decide to file a private action in federal or a state court if they are unable to afford a private lawyer?
I am not sure about that. I don't think in this case, it may not be, looking at it, I'm thinking, when you are allowed to get a lawyer, is usually you've done something and you're getting your Miranda rights read to you. In this case, you can also find lawyers that may, they're going to charge you, but they won't charge you up front if they know they have a handle on the case. But we try to tell people to get in as quickly as possible. I've had the experience of dealing with folks that would actually call you, and I would say to them, look, you have 1 year for us to handle this. And they would say, okay. I said, you need to call us back. I will send you the forms, fill out the forms, send it to us. I had a young lady call me 2 days after the year was passed. We couldn't take her case because it was past the statute. So in her case, she could, if she could have a lawyer take on her case, but I don't think they would give her one pro bono. Now, if she's not able to afford it, we have legal aid. And in many cases, legal aid has partnered with Housing Opportunities Made Equal. So that's another source that you can look at.
Thank you. I have another one, and actually, I don't know if that's a question or a statement, but let me read. I had a person with a history of eviction and bad credit and has ID and MH issues that were not being supported. The person was awarded with the HCV and was denied to several properties. And reasonable accommodation was requested, and be informed of the things that have been put into place to help with managing the money. I totally lost the.
And they refuse a reasonable accommodation. What you can do, you can file a complaint. I would first send the folks that have denied you. Yeah, you need to file complaints against them. Okay. I would love to speak to you. Yeah. Email me, and then I'll give you my number, and we can talk. Yeah, because you might need to work with Housing Opportunities Made Equal. This is one of those situations that I would recommend you work with them. They are a they're having all their 50th anniversary celebration this week. But I was still giving them a call. When you call me, I'll square you away. Okay.
Miss Mally, is that okay if I put your email address on the chat box?
Please do. Please do. Yes.
I'll do that.
Yes. And that way, if you have any, anything that is going on, you can call. If I don't answer you back right away, believe me, I will answer you back. Okay. I wanted to show y'all this one here because it's so related to what's going on now with COVID. But landlords, these landlords had a broad COVID visitor policy. What they said was they did not allow anyone under the age of 12 to visit the property. Because you remember, they were saying that if you're a certain age, you couldn't get the shot. So, they were saying younger children would bring it and give it to other people. Well, in this case, you had a grandmother that was taking care of her grandchildren. And this COVID policy denied her from taking care of the grandchildren. I was so shocked at what she received from this lawsuit because it said a resident who had been providing child care for her grandchildren was allegedly told she could no longer do so. But folks, look at what they gave her as a settlement. It was $20,000 that property had to pay her. And they had to remove the policy that was barring those visitors under the age of 12 from coming there. Fair housing is amazing. I don't know how anybody doesn't understand how powerful this law is. And then, Las Vegas, they had one with that it says here they didn't want her to have her assistant animal and refused to rent the house to her because of the dog. So even though they had approved her, they turned around and denied her the minute they saw. And she told them up front, this is my assistant's animal. So her settlement was $6,500. And she was a prospective tenant. So she wasn't even there. So folks, that's my presentation for you. I sent these in so that they would look at it and give us some added credits for you to get. And I'll get, as soon as that approval comes, I will get those who need the number. I will give you the number so that you can have it for your credits. So I think most times I can give you a certificate, and once you get the certificate, you get your credits for it. So if that works, I could do that too. All right.
Yeah.
So thank you all so much.
Thank you so much, Miss Mally. That was very informative. And that was actually my first time I had the fair housing specifically for people with disability. I had many other fair housing trainings, but this was the first time and I really enjoyed it. So thank you so much for facilitating that. And I really don't know how many people want certificate, but I appreciate if you send me an email and just letting me know that you want certificate, and I'll do the follow-up for you.
Awesome. All right. Thank you all so much for being here and for blessing us with your presence. And I hope that the information has helped.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Have a good day, y'all. Bye.
I just letting everyone to get all the information they need. Your email, my email,
I know. Yes. All right. You call me anytime you need me. I'll be here.
Absolutely. You are the best.
You're welcome. Take care, honey. Bye-bye.